In 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women resulted in the groundbreaking Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action,
an agenda for change which set the tone for the next quarter century of feminist movement building across the globe.
In honor of this momentous gathering and the women and girls who made it possible,
Breakthrough is inviting activist leaders to reflect on what happened and where we go from here.
How have the lives of women and girls changed for the better or for worse?
And how do we keep up momentum in the fight for gender equality?
I am Joanne Sandler. I am 70 years old, and I had the privilege and pleasure of attending not just the World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995, but also the World Conference on Women in Nairobi in 1985 and the World Conference on Women in Copenhagen in 1980. I missed the first one in Mexico City in 1975, but those world conferences and all the organizing before and after were really life-changing for me, and I think for many women of my generation. We're in 2021, 26 years after the last World Conference on Women. And even saying the World Conference on Women in 2021 is strange, right? Given how gender identities and our notion of gender has evolved over these past 25 years, but that's what it was. And so let me say also that I am very grateful to Breakthrough for organizing this discussion. And we have with us Amani Ju and Natalia Price. Amani from Breakthrough, Natalia, who used to work at JASS, Just Associates, which works with women's human rights defenders and now does a lot of consulting with different human rights organizations. And you can say more about yourselves, but the idea is to have this cross-generational discussion. And I want to start by asking both of you a question, which is that we often talk about standing on the shoulders of those who came before us, right? And benefiting from, but building on what they were able to achieve. And so from where you sit, Amani and Natalia, and let's start with you, Amani. What are the shoulders that you stand on? And what are the shoulders that don't exist and you really feel you wish you could stand on?
Happy to be here on behalf of Breakthrough, and happy to have you guys joining us for this series. Thank you for taking the time. But yeah, to get back to your question, I think, the shoulders that we, or I as a young activist, young feminist, identify as, I think that we stand on the shoulders of, everyone who sacrificed their life to this cause. And, that in a literal sense and in, a metaphorical sense, but in the past, this wasn't always, this was a much more life or death situation at times in terms of human rights, in terms of women's rights, in terms of gay rights. So, I think as an activist, it's important to, really acknowledge that past and acknowledge that history. And it's important to know and appreciate what people have put into this cause. And as an activist today, a young activist, I think, we have to approach everything we do with that notion that people have died for this. This is not something that I think anyone takes lightly. Anyone who identifies as an activist, as an abolitionist, as a feminist, because of that history. And so I think that only empowers, young people even more to, be like, I'm going to get out in the streets. I'm going to do everything that I can. I'm going to, you know, write my local politicians. So yeah, I think it adds a real sense of urgency and, you know, really puts the flame under my generation to, you know, really look at ourselves and like think, okay, what can we do to really, because, you know, in the past, they really moved us forward in ways that were, you know, we didn't think would be possible. So now how can we take that and, you know, move it forward to the next level?
Absolutely. Amani, what about you, Natalia?
Thanks, Joanne. Thanks, Amani. I'm Natalia Price. I think, you know, a lot of what you said, Amani, resonates with me. I think that, you know, everything I enjoy in my life is thanks to somebody, right? Is thanks to many people that came before me. I mean, we can talk about, you know, legally or in terms of access. Sure, I have the right to vote. I can have a bank account. I can work, right? And there's all this amazing work that was done to get to this point that I'm able to enjoy those things without even thinking about it as a fight or something that someone had to struggle for. But my very ability to interact with others, to feel and to be acknowledged as coexisting as an equal is you know, what we're valuing, what we're standing on the shoulders of the people before me. And so I'm grateful for all the women and men who made that possible through the generations, through the different countries, different contexts that allowed that to happen, both in terms of like activists or, you know, women who decided to raise their voices, but also people around me, right? People like who kind of physically shaped my worldview, like my parents, my family, my friends, teachers, professors, colleagues like Joanne, who, you know, is a shoulder that I continue to stand on. Thank you. But, you know, I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly trying to grow in my own strength as a person, but also as an activist. And I think being able to see people like Joanne and others, you know, their words, their actions, the energies they give off into the world, those are the shoulders I stand on, right? Those are the types of things that I vibe off of to be able to continue to do what I do. You know, I thought about this a lot. I don't think there's an area that I feel that there are no shoulders, but I do feel that there's maybe not enough attention given or not enough legitimacy given to some shoulders. Like some shoulders are given more visibility than other shoulders, so to say, right? And so I think, for example, there's so much to learn and be in awe of indigenous organizers or indigenous communities, like Native American tribes in the US or Mayans in Central America, and Afro-descendant resilience, you know, like the Garifunas in Honduras or the communities in El Chocó in Colombia, who have not only found ways to survive wars, genocide, institutionalized discrimination, and all those pieces, but are thriving in their own culture, are just have that absolute love of life, that there's so much to learn in those pieces. And so I would hope that, you know, people in my generation and younger generations find a way to uplift those voices, find a way to bring out those experiences and give it the stature that it merits. You know, from people that we already hear constantly about, maybe like in history books and the such, depending on what country you're in, especially in the West, right? There's like a very select group.
I know you have questions too, but there's one question that I'm dying to ask both of you, because this is something that has always kind of haunted me about transnational organizing. So, you know, there were all these world conferences on women that the UN, which are the member states of the world, all the countries of the world, and then parallel forums where activists, women's rights advocates come. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the United States in particular, I always noticed that the people from the United States who came were not really usually the activists from the United States. They were the people who worked transnationally. And I don't know about other countries if that was always the case as well. But so this question of how do you link local action and your commitment to your own community and your own location, right, to transnational activism, I think has always been a huge question for me. How do people do it? How do individuals do it? What does it mean when you go to Beijing, to a world conference, or even to New York, right, to the UN Commission on the Status of Women, and there are all these negotiations, and there's a document that comes out, and et cetera, et cetera. But meanwhile, you're organizing for clean water in Detroit, right? How does it link? And so I wonder in your lives, because you both are involved in local and global stuff, how do you see those links happening?
I think for me, in the way, I've approached this work has always been that because I live in the US and in different spaces that I've been, able to operate in, I sit in a very privileged position of certain spaces, right? And certain access. And so whether it's going to the UN in New York or Geneva or the CSW or whatnot, it's about ensuring that if I have that access, that I am opening the doors around me, behind me, up and down for all the other women who are organizing locally or in the different places that I'm there to then either represent or to share from, right? And so has always been a lot about how do we ensure that certain voices are always at the front and center? It isn't me that needs to speak. It isn't I that needs to be at the front or have the face. It is much more important to make sure that those that have that local experience have the seat at the global table. And that's how you make those links. So it's not just having a global person speak for the local. It's incredibly important that local voices get to speak for themselves, from their movements, from their experiences, because, they may not call it transnational activism or solidarity, right? That does kind of like lingo type, but they're doing it in action. They have communities, they've built networks, informal networks of people like they can tap into across borders or even across their countries, which sometimes we take for granted that like one country is like this, monolithic thing, but there's tons of differences even within the country. So if you're looking at a local rural community working on, like you said, access to water somewhere, just the work of connecting to someone in a different municipality or department or state, whatever it's called, is incredibly valuable. That is beyond border organizing, whatever you want to call it, cross-border organizing, right? It's just a different border, right? Or even if it's across communities, if it's across, indigenous communities or tribes or whatnot, that's huge. That is a big thing. And that's how you build that solidarity. I think that's really important. The other thing that came to mind thinking about this was, because I think there's already so much of it already happening, maybe it's just not being recognized and it's happening in informal ways and not very rigorous ways. When it is trying to then grow and actually take that next step to really be something powerful, people are overwhelmed. People are fighting for resources for life. And so it's not that they don't want to, it's not that they don't know how to make those links. They can and they want to. But how do they prioritize something like that with, someone's being, abducted, or there's not enough, they're poisoning the water, or, name all the different struggles here, that feminist organizing taps into. And so I think that there's a space for groups that play like a bridger role or connector role, facilitator roles. And there's many groups already doing this. There's AWID, there's JASS, like you mentioned, Joanne, and other groups. But oftentimes these same groups, just like the local organizing, they're understaffed, underfunded, and we need the investment, real investment to prop this up, to make transnational solidarity or feminist organizing cross-border a real effective, there's already a real strategy to make it mainstream, so to say, to make people understand that this is what's going to make change happen.
That is a really good point also, because that's at the end of the day, what you want to see is change. And I think there is a perception that there's a lot of hot air that gets unleashed, but what changes? And so Amani, from your seat, from where you sit in Brooklyn, right? How do you see that?
I would agree with everything Natalia just said, and snaps for all of that. There's real power in your voice and your experience and your story. And, you may think that as, a person who's just living in Brooklyn or whatever, that you can actually, enact that change or get the ball rolling to see that change happen in your community, in your state, in your county. But if you stand up and tell your story and talk to other people and they're like, hey, like, yeah, I feel the same way. Like, that is building that solidarity as well. And that's growing the movement. And as little of a step as it may feel like, that's a big thing. And, that's what a lot of, sorry, let me rephrase that. But, that's a big thing. And that's more important than you may think. So I would just urge people to, don't let your voice be silenced. And, write your local politicians, vote in the local, as like, the small elections, borough president, mayor, like every election, because we have to get people who represent us as a community to then further that agenda, and bring our voice along to make those changes happen.
And how did you learn that, Amani? How did you learn that? How did you learn to think about that and to act on that?
I think it's been, a long time. It's been a journey of learning and relearning and learning new things about how, our government works, about how, you can get, because a lot of it is just information that people don't know is out there. You know what I mean? People are unaware that they can, write their local representative, or, are unaware of the city council meetings that happen that you can show up at and speak your piece. So a lot of it is just getting that information out there. And, a big part of that, I think, for my generation especially, has been social media. Huge. There's been protests, movements, entire rallies organized just through Twitter. And yeah, I think it's, obviously we talk about the detriments of social media, which we all are aware of, but, I think for my generation specifically, it's been a tool to activate each other and to share information. And, I see stuff all the time living in Brooklyn that's, stuff about, hey, if you're in this area of Brooklyn, like, they are handing out free lunches like on this corner, or, just all like that kind of local information that is critical for some people. So I think that's been a real game changer in terms of, being able to activate on a smaller, more community level.
And can I just add, Amani, because you made me think of something that's really important. I totally agree with what you're saying on social media. All the pieces, fantastic. And I think what's interesting, especially from us, like in the US right now, or people maybe in Western Europe and other places in the West, we tend to, I think there's a moment where social media has allowed people to connect in this activism way, or feel connected as an activist for the first time in many ways, right? And so that's been great, because it's like you're really exposing these things to people. So they sign a letter, they draw the hashtag, they tweet, they share the meme or whatever, and then they're feeling that they're doing something, which is great. But also there's a level of surface level engagement there, right? It's not like a deeper organizing type of understanding of activism. And so, and it's not necessarily, sometimes it feels, I can think of a lot of people in my own personal circle, they feel overwhelmed. They're not really sure how to engage, where to look, how to feel that connection. And so I think one of the things that you're saying that I want to connect here is that there are probably similar struggles happening in your own community that then build that connection. So yes, maybe you're saying, SOS Columbia, right? Hashtag SOS Columbia right now, but there is a level of police brutality that you're probably seeing in your own community at some level, or in your own state, or in your own country, that you can make the connections, or an over-militarized police force, or defund the police activism is connected directly to that. How investments are made. I mean, there's immigration, and why there's migration coming from Latin America, for example, into the US, very much connected to SOS Columbia can be too, right? And other things that are happening in Central and South America. So I think feeling overwhelmed is very normal when we're kind of, first engaging into pieces of activism online, but there's so much ways to connect. And that's really how people start to feel, start to listen. So I could be excited about something or, whatnot, but how do I get, my grandma to care, right? Or how do you get the friend who just wants to go out and grab a drink real fast? How do you get them to engage beyond the hashtag And it's making those links to what they care about here, right? And then showing that that's how you build that transnational solidarity, right? Because suddenly those links are, the aha moments happen, right? And you're like, damn, I can't imagine not even being able to do X. And, you know, that's what they're fighting for. Now I get it. It's there. Let's go.
You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about organizing in the 70s and the 80s transnationally. And I still, right? I mean, there was no internet. We didn't even have fax machines until the 80s. I feel like my great grandmother right now. but the thing is, I still remember, because we got information via letters and things like that. And I was working at a place that unfortunately no longer exists, called the International Women's Tribune Center, which was a place where activists would come if they wanted to work on UN-related processes for, you know, normative change. And I remember hearing about this community in Peru, in the Pueblos Jóvenes, the slum areas of Peru, where the houses were very close together. And, you know, this was at a moment where we were still, where most people still viewed violence against women and domestic violence as a private issue. There was not legislation. It was a completely different environment. And it was the most inspiring moment, I remember, of transnational solidarity, hearing about these women who lived in the Pueblos Jóvenes. And because the houses were so close, you could hear what was happening in other houses. And so if you heard a woman being beaten or harassed by usually the men in her family, the women would all get whistles, right? And they would march out and stand in front of the house of the woman who was being abused and whistle to humiliate the perpetrator. And, you know, it was that moment of that epiphany of, you know, collective organizing at the community level that was linked to the fight that we were having at the transnational level of getting violence against women recognized as a human rights issue, and watching women in the community take into their own hands the work of protection and exposure, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that is exactly what you're both talking about, right? How those moments happen, and how must those moments happen exponentially now when there is so much access to information. Like, you're bombarded with examples of both the violations and the horror, but also the resilience and courage of communities all over the world.
No? Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I want to ask you, Joanne, as we begin to close out, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on, you know, as someone who was at the many conferences you see listed, what do you think about, you know, what did you expect? Where did you expect things to go at that point? And as you see them now, what is your take? And
oh, money.
Yeah, that's a great question.
This. I was also lucky to stand on the shoulders of a lot of activists who came before. And I think in particular of women in the Caribbean and Latin America who I was privileged to meet when I was in my 30s. And I remember one of them once talking about a conversation that she had with another activist about the state of women's rights. And the analogy she used was, you know, as we were advocating and in some ways scoring successes in the normative environment in UN processes. So, you know, getting violence against women recognized, the Declaration on Violence Against Women, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Beijing Declaration, like all of these agreements that every member state acknowledged that women's rights were an issue, that violence against women was a violation, that violence against women in the context of war was not collateral damage or boys being boys, that it was actually an abuse, a violation of human rights. I mean, these were all extraordinary achievements of organizing all over the world. And the analogy she used is, sometimes think of yourself in an elevator and the cab you're in is fine. So you're pretty secure that you're going to go up and down, but you're not aware of how the mechanism that's holding the elevator up is fraying while you're in this beautiful cab. And I sometimes feel like that's a little bit of where we were, that we were working on this gross violation of human rights, right? Women's subordination and a patriarchal system that did not prioritize well-being or care or life. And we were making advances, but there was a lot of fraying going on. And I think in the past couple of years, we've seen the really horrible implications of that, both in the political systems around the world and of course in the United States. We've seen, the thing that is so shocking is at the same time, and you have to hold these opposing ideas in your mind at the same time that I could never have imagined that the Secretary General of the United Nations would call himself a feminist. If you had asked me 20 years ago, do you think you'd ever have a feminist Secretary General? I would have laughed until I was sick. Like that would have been the funniest question. Yeah. Or a president of the United States that called himself a feminist, right? So that's a huge change in a, I would say, positive way. And would you have ever thought that voters in a somewhat of a democracy would elect the kinds of misogynistic, racist, homophobic, ethnocentric leaders that countries like the United States or, other countries have elected? Would I have ever thought that would happen? No, I also would not have thought that. So I think we are at a really pivotal moment. At a really pivotal tipping point. And it is your generation that's going to have to carry us over the finish line.
So can I ask a follow-up question there? Because I think it fits well here with Joanne. So yes, we've seen these great strides that you're talking about. And like you're saying, feminist, Secretary General. I mean, there's a million things we can name that bring that into that framework. But there's also pieces where there's almost like there's also signs that it's cracking, right? There's also signs that there's it's fragile, this very fragile sense of something like global cooperation in the United Nations, so the United Nations itself, right? You see at the one hand, something like that, and you see people talk on the stage at the, GA about rights, about protections around, citizens, civil duties and all these things. And then at night, those same leaders are, raiding homes of activists and disappearing activists, or are, taking away rights for either, sexually reproductive rights or whatnot of women in their own countries. And so there's this weird sense that even with these advances, the UN is still a place that is very fragile and very fractured in that sense. And so for people like in my generation, and I think even more so for younger generations than me, because I'm not as young as I think I am, there's a sense of disillusionment, right, with the UN, and a sense of how could we feel invested? Why should we invest all our energy and our very limited resources and energy to trying to change or to affect a system that is, is feeling like is oppressing our sisters and brothers, or it's talking big game, but not doing much, or doing the opposite. It's actually fighting against our own organizing.
Well, that's the thing about the United Nations. I think, the thing that people get very confused about with the United Nations is you think of, the United Nations didn't do anything. Who is the United Nations? The United Nations is our countries. And one of the big challenges in the United Nations is that there are some countries that have disproportionate influence, right? So the permanent members of the Security Council have disproportionate influence on what the UN can or cannot do. So that whether it's intervening in Palestine right now or in Rwanda in 1990, I don't remember what it was, 1997 in the late 90s, it is not the staff of the United Nations or the Secretary General that can make that decision. It is the member states. So as member states are more or less democratic, more or less committed to well-being, to climate justice, to racial justice, to gender justice, that is, the United Nations can only be that good. It can only be that effective. And so it goes back to something Amani said about, your local council, your local school board, your representatives, to the extent that you can strengthen democracy and strengthen representative democracy, that's the only way that the United Nations becomes effective. And I think you're right, Natalia. It's a really important question for organizers. How much time do we spend in that space if that space stops delivering for us? Because in the past, that space has delivered for us. The United Nations processes have delivered certain things, right? And even the Paris Accords, as much as they've been decimated, I think when it comes to climate change, when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to racial justice, there have been effective agreements, and there has been the kind of transnational organizing that has happened, have buttressed local organizing, have strengthened local organizing, and give people something to work toward. But I would agree that I think it's a big question going forward. Is it going to continue to be a space that is generative for democracy, social justice, and human rights? We don't know. Right. But if voters don't get their acts together and start voting in legislatures and leaders that care about human rights and social justice, then the United Nations will just become irrelevant to our work. I think that is a huge, huge challenge. Thank you, Amani, and thank you, Natalia, for inspiring me and inspiring, I'm sure, everybody who listens. And just also to say, keep going. Keep that energy high.
Thanks. No, thanks. And thanks to Breakthrough for the opportunity. This is great to bring us together. Joanne, thank you for this. Your wisdom is always so much needed. And I hope that we can continue this conversation and bring other voices in too, because, I'll say even in preparation and thinking through my participation in this, I spoke to my sisters in different places around the world too, to make sure that, it's not just me having access to this space, because it's really important.
Completely agree. Thank you both for joining us for this series with the wise words. And we got to keep that energy up and got to keep fighting the good fight.
Great. Thank you.
Both.